Hello, my monstrosities. Hello once again. Today I bring to you part two of me talking about the Tyranid army rule. As I've been doing these videos for 40k, I've tried to stray away from just criticizing a topic and not making at least a follow-up video or including in that video what I would like to see out of it, or a change, right? So the last Tyranids video I talked about, is Synapse worth it? And that was the discussion to be had, so now I want to follow up on what I think Synapse should look like in a gameplay sense, backslash make lore translate to tabletop kind of thing. So I have a lot to talk about, which is a bit of backstory as to where we are or where we've been, why we're here, and how we got here, and what I want to see in the future. That's kind of where we have these tabs labeled out. So, because this might be a long one, I'm going to get a move on it. So, uh, the thing with Synapse is that it is gives us 3d6 instead of 2d6 when we take a Battleshock test. And as I was saying in the last one, that who cares, really? Sometimes your unit may never take a battle shock test. Yes, this will be helpful for those times that you really need to take a battle shock test to pass it. And sometimes you won't have a synapse creature in range. Now, that is the fault of your own more than your opponent, but it's not the end all be all as it currently stands to keep our units within Synapse range because we don't get much from it. We get +1 strength and melee, but our melee is not very strong. Our best melee unit is, I'll let you fill in the blank because you don't ever necessarily get scared about Tyranid melee per se. Then we also have Shadow in the Warp, which is one of the few abilities left that can possibly do absolutely nothing once per game. You make your opponent take a battle shock test on everything on the field, and if they're around Synapse, it's at a -1. And with Neurotyrant, it's an additional -1, and with Death Leaper, Leadership, Dirge Heart of Chaos, you already know the things, right? But there is a chance that Shadow in the Warp does absolutely nothing. Your opponent can pass every single one of them, especially if they're playing something like Space Marines with a higher leadership. That does not fucking matter. Maybe they're playing Necrons, but everybody's huddled around the Silent King, right? Things like that does not matter. And sometimes it'll battle shock things that, yeah, it finally got battle shocked, but oh, it's the thing that's in the corner that already scored the points from the last turn. Oh, it's the thing, like, it's not consistent. And I think the thing about where the game design is headed, they're trying to remove some of the RNG of the game, and I appreciate that in a sense. They're trying to remove RNG from your army rule, right? They want consistency there. We've seen it with kind of butchering sisters. I laugh, but I think this still needs to be explored. The numbers for sisters players right now are in the gutter, and sometimes that happens to factions that are still doing good, but they're just not the current apple of everybody's eye. So I want more data on sisters before I go, yeah, this, that, whatever. But the trade off is that acts of faith are pretty powerful. You get to substitute dice into any of this list, and they're like, hey, we don't want to do that. So there's speculation that this might change by the end of the edition, too. And I should say that as well, that I was kind of pessimistic about things changing by the end of the edition. But after a couple of reviews and conversations and thinking about while I'm making some other videos, they do tend to clean things up by edition's end. Not necessarily amazing, but I think all the veterans now say I'm not that much of a veteran, right? I was getting interested at the end of ninth and, full hauled at 10th. But other veterans will talk about how it seems like they always get it right by the time the edition is ending, and then they have to start back over the next edition. So, I think there is some faith that maybe, just maybe, Tyranids and Sisters army rule gets a little bit fixed. And you might even go, well, does it need to happen? We're doing okay stat wise, number wise, right? Maybe yes or no, but I do want to talk about some of the things from a design aspect a little bit later. So, Sisters, they got nuked because too much RNG, too much chance that can make either person feel too bad. And then we have GSC that also had a similar mechanic where it's just like, hey, every time you lose something, roll and see if you get a benefit or not. They finally cleaned it up and just said, hey, we're going to make it resurgence points, and you have to allocate those to your own discretion. You get 10 in a 2,000 point game, figure it out. And so far, GSC players have been saying, hey, we have figured that shit out. It looks okay. And one of the more recent additions to this is Eldari completely losing the fate dice that, well, I shouldn't say completely. Well, their iteration of it. It has changed into something different. Um, into one of the detachments. But now they have battle focus, which, now mind you, I know the leaks are out there. I just want to highlight how funny it is that, in my quest to not go on the spoilers and put them on the screen because I don't really know. Um, Looking and pulling the article up, I don't know what happened here. I guess they just deleted two of the images. Like I refreshed a couple of times, over time too. I don't know where these two disappeared. But if you're unfamiliar, now the Eldar will have tokens that they can allocate to activate shit like can't be overwatched while you're moving. You can fade back in your opponent's shooting phase after your opponent shot one of your things. You can make a normal move. So they've completely done away with, hey, how about re-roll your entire situation, right? Now, mind you, that was the detachment, and I want to get to that in a second. But on top of that, you combine that with inputting dice on the sisters level, and that's when everybody was upset at the start of 10th. So they said we might have some rerolls still. They put a lot of rerolls in aspect host, if I remember correctly. I'm still trying to figure out which detachment does which, if I'm being honest. Get a grip on it. But for the army rule, it is battle focus, and you get to schmoove a little bit. That's what we're doing here. So they've definitely pushed towards that. Now, the thing that I want to talk about, into which an issue with something like Synapse, and why I was hesitant when Grotmus came around for some of the armies, I knew it wasn't going to end well because GW made, in my opinion, a bit of a fucky wucky. For the index detachments, they got the rules for some armies that I think should have been the army rule. That's just my opinion. Because it's hard to beat some of the things. Invasion fleet, we're still trying to get over. Man, I could just take sustained hits one into an infantry army, or a lethal hits into heavy's army, right? Nobody's using the precision shit, right? But it's really hard to beat that, and then a 5-up feel no pain. Like, it's just consistent, and it works for all of your fucking units. So, that's unfortunate. And going into those types of armies, we have Death Guard that got Flyblown host, and everybody's but my contagion range, it doesn't do anything now. Forgetting that it does still give -1 toughness, but to that end, wouldn't it have been better for Death Guard to be able to choose which of their contagions, because that just makes sense from the Death Guard army, and they might still do this once Death Guard's Codex comes out. Wouldn't it be, or wouldn't it make more sense that they switch Play Company and Nurgle's Gift, right? It just makes more sense that, oh, how about in this detachment, your contagion does X, Y, and Z, but overall, you can choose what contagion you want to give because you are playing Death Guard, and Death Guard has more than one ailment to be spread. One contagion, one sickness, right? So it's that type of thing that would make more sense. And Thousand Suns also are going to be in a tricky situation because they gave them the psychic phase, basically, again, right? And you have Cult of Magic, which again is hard to beat when you can choose what the fuck you need in the situation. As we saw with Hexwarp Thrallband, we're not going to see Hex Warp Thrall banned. And people speculate that they are going to rework the army rule so that you can use other things besides Cult of Magic. I do want to say, going back to Eldar for a second, I think that shit is way too fucking hopeful. Um, that's maybe me being a pessimist again, but I knew Armored Warhost. Now, again, this is early speculation, and there's plenty of time for me to be proven terribly wrong. So, if I am, feel free to come back in the video and tell me that I'm stupid. But give me some context. Armored Warhost that came out for Grotmans is like, oh, that's with the Codex Army rule change in mind. It's gonna be better, great. No, there was no fucking way to change that type of rules, and I don't think there's anything you could do to Thousand Suns that makes Hexwarp Thrallband make more sense without completely breaking Thousand Suns. Because do you take away Cabal points for no reason? Like, they aren't topping at that dominance that they were for a bit anymore. Cult of Magic is still good, so if anything, I think expecting an entire rework that is going to make Hexwarp Thrallband any better is cope. I don't know. That shit was egregious, but we'll see. And then I want to go on to the data sheets that has landed us here as to why I'm reviewing what an army rule update for Synapse that, in my opinion, should have been Invasion Fleet, or since they've been eliminating RNG from the Shadow and the Warp aspect. Now, I'm not saying that we get rid of Shadow and the Warp, right? It's the one that's like okay enough, I guess, out of the two. But for the data sheets wise, I was looking at the Screamer Killer. I've told Chaos that you need to be taking your Hell Brutes out of Death Guard and regular CSM. I've told Chaos Knights that you should be looking at the Abominant. I've told Chaos Demons, look at the Skull Cannon. So how is it that I can say to look at these models that people aren't too high on, but not equate it to the same thing over in hours? And then I realize, because that shit is completely fucking different, even though it looks very similar. Why is that? The other ones interact with your army rule. The Screamer Killer interacts with a couple of other data sheets within our army. See, our army rule doesn't say anything happens when the opponent is battle shocked, right? It doesn't say that. It just says you can battle shock, you can try to battle shock your opponent. It's like the Psychomancer from Necrons, where actually that shit doesn't have to do with jack shit, right? Now I found an interesting thing to which the Psychomancer can be useful in Necrons, but no, there's nothing here that explicitly gives me a benefit for bringing the Screamer Killer instead of just using my army, right? Like, nothing here beyond the words, your opponent takes a battle shock test, affects anything that happens over here. Yeah, it can be nice to double down on, alright, I used Shadow in the Warp, so now one or two, maybe maybe I got lucky. My entire opponent's battlefield is battle shocked. Oh, then I don't need the Screamer Killer. Alright, there's just one that didn't get battle shocked, but I really needed to be battle shocked. But it's after my shooting phase, so what needed to happen there? Like, maybe if there's some of the things that need to not be battle shocked by the end of an action, but outside of that, this isn't the buffing piece that you would imagine. But then I also realized what unit out of our codex is perfectly designed. Out of all of our things, this might be the best designed unit. The Neurotyrant. It has something that helps you interact with your army rule, both halves of it. You can spread Synapse so that, the leadership test is better. Sorry, the battle shock test is better, but now also additional in melee. And it can inflict a -1 for Shadow in the Warp, as well as if your opponent is battle shocked from something like Shadow in the Warp, that unit is +1 to wound against, or Neurotyrant's unit is +1 to wound against that battle shocked unit. So that's pretty good considering the rest of our codex. Last video, I talked about how Synapse kind of got hamstrung to several things, so now the two most important pieces from an army cohesion standpoint are the Walkrent and the Neurotyrant. Now, don't really want to spend too much time going back onto that, but because the army had no fucking damage, no way to do damage outside of praying for a Battleshock test next to a Neurolictor, right? They said, alright, here's lethals. And we'll put that on your Hive Tyrant, so you can take that in every fucking list. And because you have absolutely no fucking way of doing good melee damage, here's +1 strength and Synapse range. Alright, cool. Um, how do you get Synapse spread to shit that would like to be in melee range? The Neurotyrant. How do you do more damage for ranged? Well, now we're looking at the Hive Tyrant, right? So that combination of things led us to where we are, where the rest of the codex is kind of fucked. And I will be yelling about Invasion Fleet once more. They're going past the Neurotyrant. The other things that interact with Battleshock are the Neurolictor, of course, which, you know, has an interaction if multiple things fail Battleshock around it because of Shadow in the Warp. That's nice. And it is good to remember the Neurolictor didn't start off having Synapse. So if you want to go, oh, but it also had Synapse, so it covered the melee things. That's not how we started. That was a, what do you mean, this brain bug? All the other bugs with brains, except for the Parasite and Brewlord again, because they fucked up, has Synapse. How did we skip that, right? And they're like, alright, you're right, it should have Synapse. So you have that goes in, and now I guess you can say that it's a buffing piece for melee to an extent, and it will be up the board because it has infiltrate. Uh, but beyond that, sure, now it has some idea of play with your army rule because Shadow in the Warp +1 to wound, plug and play. Death Leaper causes battle shock, but again, just because you cause battle shock doesn't do anything for your army rule. Same with the Haruspex, same with the Moloch, same with the Parasite of Mortrex. I've been racking my brain about how to make this thing better, but again, we look and go, well, we're like supposed to do battle shock things, right? That's what we're told. We have Shadow in the Warp, and we have Synapse. You know, it's match made there. We're supposed to do battle shock things. But looking at the roster, I think we might have overindulged in that plot line. I think we've given too much credit on what our design space was. It's just like, yeah, you're Tyranids, you know about Battleshock. It's like, I do, but not really. Because how many of these units are brought in multiple lists? Screamer Killer, not often. Neurotyrant, see in play. Neurolictor, not anymore. Death Leaper, very rarely now. Haruspex, getting up there now. Because we finally have Harvester, we finally have Assimilation Swarm in a better spot. Moloch falling out of favor, wasn't really that easy to trigger the Battleshock test either. Parasite of Mortrex, haven't seen it all edition. So, out of that, were we supposed to be the Battleshock army? I don't think so. So then, it comes into the, well, something should happen if your opponent is Battleshocked, right? Like, something should happen. That's true. That is true. But you can't do that anymore. You can't do the obvious answers anymore because you've given it to other spaces, right? We have Chaos Knights that got finally feel like they have an army rule, into which if your opponent is within 12 inches of this model, if they take a Battleshock test, it's at -1, and if they fail the Battleshock test, it's the Neurolictor. So you have Death Leaper up here and Neurolictor here. And you can't give that to us because then you invalidate the Death Leaper and Neurolictor. Now, mind you, they did get back around to updating the Eldari datasheets after unfucking that army rule. But beyond that, it is not worth making it so that you have to undo that because you can't just give a flat +1 to wound because what is the purpose of these units you've printed now? And I don't know if we're okay enough in the game to where you try to flip that aspect of it. That's why I'm not recommending that we still try to flip Invasion Fleet and the Army rule. I don't think it works anymore. Or I think that ship has sailed by now on trying to make that how it would go, right? Another army that has some interaction with failing Battleshock test, Chaos Demons. Now, I also look at it and go, so what is the purpose of your army rule? Outside of interacting with demonic incursion, what is the purpose? Besides spreading -1 to Battleshock test, if they're within the shadow of chaos. There we go. And then taking some mortal wounds or healing you. So, healing you if you pass your Battleshock test, that is. So, it's interesting that I don't value Chaos Demon's army rule very highly, but it still has an effect beyond just being battle shooketh, right? Now, there is the discussion to be had about how impactful Battleshock is, right? Um, and how dangerous that can become. Because you can't you can't just slap on an effect after that because if we have a game-wide trigger Battleshock test, you can't ask your opponent's army to possibly take D3 once per game or not at all. You can't make it so that everything is just Battleshock all the time because that means that you are locking your opponent out of playing the game. But like verbatim, right? If everything just is Battleshocked all the time because of an army rule of all things, that means that your opponent is not scoring points, not holding primary, which, not scoring points. Uh, Now, mind you, you could make the argument, well, technically it can happen in Chaos Knights, and that's correct, right? That is technically something that can happen, especially with Trader's Lands, making it so that if your opponent is below starting strength, they have to take a Battleshock test. And around a Chaos Knight. So I guess you could argue that it can be done, but where does that stop? And where does that even play into the rest of the army, right? Because we're not, by lore, not I'm just the the battle shock thing. Yeah, we have the shadow and the warp, which is supposed to be a cutoff of like the warp, right? You're supposed to block things out, blot it out. So the shadow and the warp aspect of what we have over in Tyranids makes sense. Synapse, in my opinion, not quite. Because it's supposed to give more tactics. It's supposed to do things. It's supposed to influence the mindless beast. And yeah, mind you, they're less susceptible to being battle shocked. But as we've seen in past editions, Synapse was just like, hey, you can't be battle shocked, which makes sense because from the way they've set up battle shock is like, I mean, they have moved away from morale tests, so I guess technically not that either. But the mindless beast losing its connection to the hive mind wasn't going to just fuck off, right? But, I mean, I guess you could argue that's the other thing, that it is fucking off. It is not falling through with what needs to happen. So I guess making it harder for that to happen makes sense from that aspect. But then the band-aid fix of +1 to strength in melee does still kind of piss me off because that isn't our strong suit anywhere to where it comes into play. Like, you did that because you printed all of the numbers way too fucking low. And it was just like, hey, I would like to not just die in melee with my giant monster. That just doesn't make sense. Um, but you also have it so that my giant monster still isn't doing much in melee because I'm dealing with AP 1 and 2. So there's that. Going on from that, I do want to look back in time for a second. Let's look at what Synapse used to be in ninth edition, where you have synaptic imperative abilities. Now, mind you, I do want to scroll up. You do have synaptic link range, synapse, the automatically pass morale test things I was talking about. You have swarm masses for certain units, death from below certain units, shadow and warp certain units, synaptic link range, yada yada yada. But the discussion I was having with Necromancer Goblin in my comment section was the fact that at a point in time, you had Synapse working, right? Synapse was doing things, and the fact that, oh, they were influenced by what the hive mind through what the unit was. So you have things like uh, fall back in charge, cover, sustain for range and melee. You have +2 to move characteristics, psychic test bullshit, ranged attacks, perform an action, can still make ranged attacks. You know, all the things that will stop you from performing an action now on the Maleceptor. The Zoe's, instead of a 6-up invuln range, it's a 4-up invuln, which, you know, for monsters that is. 5-up for everybody else. Parasite of Mortrex, pile and consolidate. And the problem is, some of these things either are now in other places because, like, the Parasite of Mortrex, the pile and consolidate is one of the stratagems for Invasion Fleet, right? Zoe still have this to a lesser extent. Um, Hell, I'd argue maybe you do make it a 5-up invulnerable save for that buffer, but then you run into the issues again of, well, would that bring Unending Swarm back? And I know that they don't want to do that. Fall back in charge. You kind of stapled that on to Vanguard Onslaught. So that's also on the ranged Tyranid warriors. So there's that. Sustained, guess what? Stapled that onto Invasion Fleet, so can't really do that one either. So all of this kind of got scattered amongst the winds, and they're not in a cohesive place anymore. But the thing is, the other thing that is upsetting to me, besides the fact that Trigon Prime isn't here anymore, is that you still have semblance of this with Imperial Knights Bondsman abilities. You still have some characteristic in the game that goes, or some ability, I don't know why I blinked on that word, some ability in the game that says, hey, if you are an underling of mine because of this, you get to do this, right? So we still have that, and it's weird that that just got shipped straight over here and not still considered for the Tyranids, like at all. And the other thing that, going back to the lore aspect of, yeah, you gotta kill the Sinnoh beast because it is the swarm is fighting with more tactics and more strategy, and you gotta let them kind of fuck around and find out because now they don't know what they're doing. So I was a little bit pissed where instead of voice of command coming over to us for the Grodmist detachment, right? It went to the fucking orcs. And like, I get it. I get it. The blood axes. I understand. Doesn't mean I can't be jealous still, right? Like, it just makes more sense for something to the commands through the fucking hive mind to go through the hive mind. And I guess this is how they could fix Synaptic Nexus. I guess they can do it that way. But come on, man, you gave it to the fucking orcs. So that's that soapbox real quick. I won't spend too much time on it. Going for that. Finally, what do I think Synapse should do? Now that we've gone through everything about where it's been, what the current direction of the game is, yada yada yada, what do I think it should do? Well, that's these final three tabs. Three tabs. Iconoclast Fiefdom. One thing that has made no sense to me that we don't have access to is what you have in Iconoclast Fiefdom and in Brood Brothers Auxilia for GSC is basically worthless chattel or acceptable losses. How is it that the hive mind that is known to just throw bodies at a problem, each little hormigant, termagant, gargoyle, all the gaunts, no, we have to stop that target, right? That's the thing, that's the target. I have strategy now. Gotta stop that thing over there. And the big monsters, like, you're not an individual, you're a part of the swarm. So, how is it that we don't have access to a worthless chattel acceptable losses? And for those unfamiliar, it is basically being able to shoot within engagement range of your unit, right? So if your unit is in engagement range with the enemy, you can still shoot the enemy and then roll a die and possibly lose some models. So now I know that we have history with engagement range shenanigans that they probably don't want to repeat, such as with swarming masses, into which that engagement range could get pretty long for some units, right? But I think it makes sense for the Tyranids that are within Synapse range, and honestly, you, you could argue that they would be more likely to possibly kill their allies when they're not within Synapse, but it makes more sense that this, from my head canon, right? It would make more sense that since the Synapse is activated in a way that the target needs to be stopped, your exocrine can shoot the target that is getting bogged down by hormigons, right? Make it so that there's some play there, um, and kind of a way of Lions Blade Task Force. And I'm not quite done, if I'm being honest. I think the other thing that my grievance with our melee is not just that we have low strength. You could also argue there's that there needs to be more AP. I highly agree. However, I don't know if, well, this is my thing. From again looking at it to a lore perspective, I don't understand why +1 strength is the thing that's there. From, like, you don't go, oh, I'm stronger now because I'm like, if you're hitting a target wildly, you should probably have the same amount of strength as if you were hitting intelligently, right? No, I guess you could argue that there's technique and form of throwing a punch and so, but that applies to us. I don't think it should apply to a bug. That's just my, I guess, idea. So going on from that, I would like within Synapse range +1 strength, +1 to charge, so I can fucking get there. And I know that we have that in Synaptic Nexus, but yeah, just make that essentially +2 to charge for that turn for the units. I would also still like Synaptic Nexus to be changed, but there's that. The other thing that I talked about, what I would like to see, this way it would interact with all of our army rule, but I gave this as a suggestion for Unending Swarm, is that I would like to see our units proc Desperate Escape tests, right? We have the Toxicrin and the Norn Assimilator that do something when your opponent falls back. You either remain stationary or you take some mortal wounds, but we don't have Desperate Escape tests, which doesn't make sense to me. Because you should be trying to get out of the swarm of bugs or the monster. Like, this should be a desperate escape. Now, of course, you do still have that mechanic, right? If your opponent is trying to do a fallback move and they're battle shocked, of course that triggers a desperate escape. But it's not like you're fighting another person. It's not like you're fighting chaos. It's not like you're fighting a Necron, right? You are. Everything else is still fucking humanoid. If you are trying to leave a swarm of Hormigons, it should be an issue. So, personally, I would like to see that if your opponent tries to fall back from a unit that is within Synapse range, they must take a Desperate Escape test. That's what I would like to see. Hey, if you could just trigger them from being fucking Ravenwing, I think that's fine for my extra step over here. Um, that's one thing I would like to see, and I would also like to see that way our ranged units. Which the other difficult thing about trying to figure out what to do for ranged out of Synapse is that you can't necessarily make the Exocrine better, and you can't make yeah, you just can't make the Exocrine or Malishifter better, really, or the Tyrant effects. You can't add more AP. You can't add rapid fire. You can't add +1 to wound, and like a lot. You can't do a lot of shit because no matter what happens, you're going to end up in fucking invasion fleet. Even an idea that I threw out into which +1 to save, I was like, damn it, you can't do that because if you give +1 to save, you're still just going to go right over to invasion fleet and then take your 5 up, feel no pain. And then your opponent is really going to be upset, and that throws off the game. You give +1 to save and go into Assimilation Swarm. Now, I already said that that's our best detachment, and people are, I think, slowly figuring that out, but I still won't talk about that just quite yet. But, then it becomes a problem. I was thinking about things that you can do that won't necessarily break the game. Another consideration I had was additional range because, oh, you're more precise at range. You know your target, you're shooting at the target. Um, that's still up for there and could possibly be a safer pick because it effectively doesn't do anything for your exocrine, right? Like if it's already our longest range option, like realistically, besides the Tyrannifex's rupture cannon, right? It doesn't it doesn't do anything giving that more range. Meanwhile, giving the Zoes more range means I don't feel bad about bringing the think tank. They don't have to get nearly as close with them being fragile. And you go, well, you're just trying to remove the weakness of the unit, and kind of, because that's a big fucking weakness. They are all 4 up or die with 24-inch range blast, so if they get touched, you still have to use the last cannon profile because you're hopefully using it with the Neurotyrant, which is another 105 points, so that way you can get access to big guns and never tire. And then you're taking it, at the threes. So it is interesting, right? But then that's 6 shots compared to what you would have done with being able to fire within engagement range, or technically your opponent not being there, because there is, a difference that was pointed out to me on the Brood Brothers Auxilia video, into which I was like, oh yeah, I guess you're right. So I would like to say thank you to. Should have had that pulled up. I'm sorry, but thank you to Kada, Kada, um, into which it was like, hey, it should be noted that you can't fire within engagement range like the other ones say, so you technically can't do blast weapons. It just says over here unacceptable losses, but you can make ranged attacks into the unit compared to worthless chattel, or I think there's another one. Oh, the Zinch scintillating legion also has it, where it's like, oh yeah, you can. Is it scintillating legion that has it? Maybe I'm misremembering, but it should be noted that you should be able to fire your gun and make sure that the unit isn't considered within engagement range. Is more so. So a unit that is engaged with another unit, if your unit has Synapse, your opponent's unit is no longer considered within engagement range of your unit, is what I want to see. Because it makes no sense that the Chaos Knights get to fire into damned units, and that GSC gets to fire. I'm sorry, Astra Militarum gets to fire into GSC, but the bugs don't get to fire into the bugs, where the bugs are the hive mind will, right? That just, I don't know. So, to make it quick and clean and the wrap up to this video, what I would like to see is for Synapse, and the other thing that going into this, is that if there's desperate escape tests and then they are Battleshock, that means that they're taking that Desperate Escape test at -1. Um, so what I would like to see as an update or moving forward to Synapse is that each time a model, you keep this because why not, right? Honestly, if you got rid of it, I wouldn't care. But that's just me. I know some people sometimes really rely on it, and it is handy. But each time this unit takes a Battleshock test, take that test on 3d6 instead of 2d6. Each time a model in that unit makes a melee attack, add 1 to the strength characteristic of that attack, and units it is within engagement range of are not considered to be within engagement range for the purposes of ranged attacks from allied Tyranids. I guess that's the way that GW would probably write that. As well as if your opponent tries to make a fallback move while within engagement range of a unit within Synapse, it becomes a desperate escape test. Now, that does sound like a lot, so probably not my desperate escape test thing, but there does need to be something for ranged, right? It does need to be something for ranged, but at the same time, you can't make the exocrine better, and it does need to help us out. So, would the ranged Tyranid warriors still need something different? Yeah, because they have fallback, shoot, and charge. I mean, I guess at that point you could argue that instead of firing within engagement range or whatever, they can fall back somewhere and charge. Like, that's still handy besides just shooting your gun, I guess. So technically, you don't need to change that. But for the purposes of hopefully updating Synapse to do something, I would like to see Desperate Escape Test. That way it has some interaction with Shadow and the Warp. But mind you, I guess you could say it doesn't have to do that, because if they're battle shocked within engagement range and try to fall back anyway, it would already happen. But that's just my wishful thinking. Um, but beyond that, you should be able to have acceptable losses or worthless chattel as the bugs. You are looking for a target. So Synapse range should be able to fire gun into engagement range, but technically not engagement range because all of our shit is fucking blast. So if you make this change without doing that part, I'm back to square one and not having shit to use because all of our fucking guns are blast. Damn near all of them. Blast here, blast here, blast here, blast here. Like, yeah, that'd be cool to put my flamer into, so the Swarm Lord, Pyrovores, uh, Hive Crone, Psychophage, but beyond that, blast. All of our shit is blast. I guess technically the Toxicrin isn't, and Trigon isn't, but there's those problems within themselves and the Carnifexes. So, TLDR, I want access to worthless chattel or acceptable losses somehow, some way. So, yeah. If you like the video, like it. Got a comment for me, comment. And until next time, peace out, my monstrosities.